On March 5, 1931, a hotel corridor in Manhattan heard a sound it hadn't heard in years. A human voice asking for help. It wasn't a shout. It was a thin, trembling plea drifting from behind a door most employees treated like a fixture always there, never changing. A maid was the one who paused. She knew the rhythms of the building, late arrivals, breakfast trays, gossip from open rooms. This voice didn't fit. It sounded frightened, and it sounded old. When she stepped closer, the words sharpened. A sister was sick, a doctor was needed, and death felt near. The maid knocked. The door opened wider than it had in decades, and the person in the gap looked less like a resident and more like a survivor. She was tiny, bent forward as if her spine had been folded by time. Her hearing was poor, her body fragile, and yet her face held an uncanny softness, as if years had been repelled rather than endured. She was crying the kind of crying that happens when control breaks. The maid ran for the manager. He arrived and stopped at the smell seeping into the hall. He had managed this place for years and still had never entered that suite. He knew the occupants only as cash payments slid through a narrow opening, as food requests delivered to a door that rarely moved. Now the door was open, and he was being pulled into a story the hotel had unknowingly hosted for a quarter century. Inside, the rooms were dim and crowded. Newspapers piled high like leaning walls. Boxes stacked in every corner, wrapped bundles, old string, paper scraps, and dust on top of dust. In the parlor, a couch held a still body under a sheet. The sister was dead. Her name, the frail woman said, was Ida Wood. The dead sister was Mary Mayfield. Those names carried an echo of another era, the time of carriages and society columns. But the scene did not match that echo. This was a cramped fortress made of paper, secrecy, and neglect. A hotel doctor arrived and confirmed the death. An undertaker was called, and then the story shifted from private tragedy to public obsession. The undertaker sensed there was more here than grief and grime. He contacted lawyers. Soon, legal men in suits stepped into the chaos, and the frail woman began to talk as if words had been stored up for years. Her speech came in bursts, names, events, bragged memories, half-sentences. She spoke of ballrooms and important men. She claimed she had been married to Benjamin Wood, a publisher and politician. She mentioned Fernando Wood, a powerful figure in New York politics. She placed herself in the path of famous history, claiming she had danced with royalty and met a president. The lawyers looked at each other. Was this broken figure really that woman? Then Ida said something simple that made the room tilt. There was money here. Not a few dollars. Not savings money. The search began carefully. A battered shoebox held financial papers. Another container hid bonds. A trunk revealed jewelry. Each discovery made the air heavier. The room, disgusting as it looked, was also a vault. The biggest shock came later. After nurses were assigned to care for Ida while she slept, they noticed an odd bulge in her clothing. They examined the lining of her nightgown and found a hidden pouch sewn into the fabric. Inside were thick stacks of large bills. She had been carrying and sleeping with a fortune pressed against her body. In 1931, with breadlines in the streets and banks collapsing, the idea of a woman hiding a mountain of wealth inside a filthy hotel suite was irresistible. Newspapers descended. Reporters crowded the lobby. Cameras waited for anyone entering or leaving. People claimed they had always wondered about those sealed rooms. Within days, the hotel became a theater. Strangers leaned against the front desk pretending to be guests. Men with notebooks hunted for staff willing to talk. Someone swore they had seen Ida years earlier. Someone else insisted the sisters were foreign spies. The rumors were absurd, but they spread because the facts were scarce. Ida herself offered little beyond her claims and her tears. When questions came, she repeated fragments or fell silent, as if speaking cost her something precious. The less she explained, the more valuable every scrap became, turning a locked door into a national riddle, and every new detail raised the suspicion. She wasn't hiding from poverty. She was hiding from her story. But the story was bigger than money. The real engine was the question that hovered over every detail. Why would anyone do this? Why would a person with unimaginable resources choose isolation and squalor? Was it fear? Was it madness? Or was it something colder? Something that made the isolation feel less like a collapse and more like a plan? Because if this was a plan, then the money wasn't the secret. The money was the evidence. As lawyers inventoried the fortune and the city buzzed, a second layer of mystery emerged. Ida Wood, as she described herself, had a past filled with glamour. Yet the records were messy, the details slippery. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed her identity. A door had opened, but it didn't open into a simple room. It opened into a life built like a stage set, something designed to be seen from a distance, not inspected up close. And now, for the first time in 24 years, strangers were inspecting to understand how a person reaches the point of sewing money into clothing and locking herself away. You have to go backwards. You have to follow the trail past the headlines, past the dust, back to the moment she first learned the power of becoming someone else, because Ida Wood didn't just hide money, she hid herself. To the public, Ida Wood arrived fully formed, a wealthy widow, a society figure, a mystery, but no one is born a mystery. A mystery is built, and long before Manhattan hotels and sealed doors, there was a different girl living under a different set of expectations. In a world that demanded obedience from the poor and offered no shortcuts. Her birth name was Ellen Walsh. Records place her early life in the north of England, a landscape shaped by mills and smoke. Cotton and machinery ruled the skyline, and families lived by the discipline of the shift bell. The air carried soot, streets carried workers, children carried responsibility. You learned early that comfort was not a birthright but a prize, and most people never won it. Ellen's parents were Irish. Like so many families of that century, they moved where survival looked possible. Ireland had offered hardship, and England offered work, but work did not equal security. The Walsh household grew crowded. Siblings came one after another. Feeding them required relentless labor and constant improvisation. Hunger was not a dramatic event, it was a background noise. Then came the larger tide that swallowed individual stories. Emigration to America. For Irish families, the Atlantic crossing promised a reset. It also delivered terror. Steerage travel was cramped and unsanitary. Many arrived weaker than they left. Those who survived arrived weakened and disoriented, and they carried exhaustion, the exhaustion of realizing you escaped one struggle only to face another. The Walsh family settled in Massachusetts, near communities where Irish newcomers clustered for support. Catholic churches and familiar accents offered a sense of belonging, but the broader society did not welcome them. Anti-Irish sentiment was common. Employers posted signs refusing Irish labor. Newspapers mocked immigrants. Even when work existed, dignity was rationed. In that environment, childhood ended early. Ellen, like many immigrant daughters, entered domestic service while still young. She worked in other people's homes, cleaning other people's messes, serving meals she didn't get to eat, polishing silver that would never be hers. The work could be demeaning, but it had an education hidden inside it. Servants see everything. They hear how families talk when they believe no one important is listening. They watch what wealth looks like when it is normal, not displayed. Ellen learnt the difference between money and status. Money bought objects, but status bought permission. Permission to speak. Permission to move through the world without being questioned. Permission to be assumed respectable. She studied manners the way a hungry person studies a menu. She noticed which words sounded right, which accents opened doors, which silences signaled power. She learned that the wealthy did not panic the way the poor panicked. They made plans. They delegated fear. At the same time, Ellen learned the fragility of a poor family's position. One illness could break a household. One layoff could turn rent into a crisis. One bad season could scatter siblings across states. The Walsh family's later record suggests exactly that kind of scattering. People went where there was a job, and that meant families became loose networks instead of tight units. So imagine Ellen as a young woman standing in that reality. What choices were available? Marriage to a man as poor as she was, a lifetime of service, a slow fading into the background, or something else, something risky, something that required a different kind of courage. The courage to abandon the identity you were handed. Here's the crucial point. Reinvention is not simply vanity. For people locked out of opportunity, reinvention can feel like the only tool left. Ellen did not have a fortune to inherit. She did not have a respected surname. She did not have an education designed to lift her. She had observation, intelligence, and the knowledge that society often rewards confidence more than truth. In 1857, at 19, she left Massachusetts for New York City. That date matters because it marks a clean cut. After that train ride, Ellen Walsh begins to fade in the record, and a new figure begins to appear in the social imagination. New York was far enough to hide in, it was crowded enough to be anonymous, and it was ambitious enough to tolerate a stranger if the stranger looked and sounded convincing. But the city did not grant success automatically. It offered a stage, not a script. Ellen would have needed to decide exactly who she wanted to be before she could persuade anyone else. When she arrived, she didn't carry trunks of clothing or introductions to powerful families. She carried the most dangerous asset an outsider can carry, a willingness to pretend. That willingness can destroy you if you misjudge your audience. But if you judge correctly, it can lift you faster than honest labor ever could. Think about the pressure of that moment. You step off the train into noise and motion. You have no safety net. Your accent can betray you. Your past can trap you. Every conversation is a test. One wrong answer can expose you. Yet Ellen stepped into the city and made a choice that would shape the rest of her life. She would not be Ellen Walsh anymore. She would become Ida Mayfield. And once she chose that name, she had to build everything behind it. The family story, the reason she was in New York, the mannerisms that would make people stop suspecting. She needed a doorway into the circles that could validate her lie. She needed a protector, an anchor, and, eventually, money she could control. The locked hotel door of 1931 did not begin with madness. It began with a young woman learning a lesson America teaches in whispers. If people can't verify your past, they will often accept the past you present, especially if it flatters their desire to believe they can recognize refinement on sight. Ellen Walsh understood that, and she was about to use it. New York City in 1857 did not care who you were yesterday. It cared what you looked like today, who would vouch for you, and whether you could hold your posture under pressure. That indifference was a gift for someone like Ellen Walsh. In a smaller town, a new story would be questioned by neighbors who remembered your mother. In Manhattan, strangers passed each other like ships. A woman could arrive with a suitcase, a practiced smile, and an invented past, and the city would simply keep moving. But anonymity alone is not reinvention. Reinvention requires precision. Ellen had watched wealth close up in other people's parlors. She knew that the difference between acceptable and suspect often came down to details. How you held a cup, how you introduced yourself, which names you recognized, which names you pretended to recognize. So she began by studying. She collected newspapers, not for wars or politics, but for social columns. Those paragraphs mapped an invisible city: who attended which dinner, which families hosted balls, which clubs mattered, which women were praised, and which were quietly ruined by a whisper. If you wanted to enter that world, you had to understand its grammar. She picked a name that sounded soft, aristocratic, and pleasantly vague: Ida Mayfield. It suggested warmth and lineage without pointing to a traceable place. Walsh announced Irish immigrant roots. Mayfield sounded like old land and inherited comfort. A name was a key, and she chose one that fit the lock she wanted. Then she built the backstory. People would ask where she was from. She needed answers that sounded effortless. She invented a father with money, a southern connection that carried glamour in the northern imagination, and a mother with just enough old-world flavor to impress. She didn't invent a perfect story. She invented a believable one, something that could be repeated without stumbling. The risk was always exposure. If someone decided to verify her claims, the entire structure could collapse. But Ellen understood a social truth that still holds. Most people do not investigate what makes them feel comfortable. New York's upper circles wanted to believe they could spot refinement instantly. If Ida carried herself like a lady, then the circle could congratulate itself for recognizing her. Doubting her would mean doubting their own judgment. So Ida performed. She softened her accent. She chose clothing that suggested restraint rather than desperation. She learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. She made her presence feel natural. She made her mystery feel elegant. Still, none of that guaranteed entry. She needed a connection, someone already inside who could pull her through the gate. The society pages offered a list of potential anchors. She chose one name that appeared again and again: Benjamin Wood. Wood was a publisher, a politician, and a man with influence. He was older, established, and connected to a powerful family. He also had a reputation for enjoying the company of attractive women. That last detail mattered because it meant he might respond to a bold approach that would scandalize a stricter man. Ida wrote to him. It was not a modest letter. It was not the kind of letter a careful young woman sent. It was confident, suggestive, and designed to flatter his vanity. The message was simple. She was new, she was interesting, and she believed he was the kind of man who appreciated novelty. She included a reply address that allowed privacy. She signed it with a name that echoed her old self just enough to feel real, then erased it. When Wood replied, Ida won her first major gamble. A reply meant access. Access meant an opportunity to present her performance in person, where charm could do what paper could not. Their meeting became the hinge of her life. Wood saw a poised young woman who looked and sounded like the world she claimed. She spoke confidently about her origins. She did not hesitate under questions. She did not act grateful, which would have signaled weakness. Instead, she acted as if meeting him was simply an interesting choice among many. He was captivated, and once captivated, he became useful. The relationship that followed was complicated and, for its time, Wood was married, and Ida was not his wife. Yet New York society often practiced selective vision. Powerful men carried private arrangements as long as they kept public appearances. Ida understood that. She wasn't seeking purity. She was seeking position. Wood began to place her in rooms that mattered. He introduced her to people who could repeat her name. He brought her to dinners, theaters, and clubs where visibility created legitimacy. Each appearance strengthened the illusion. If she was present, then she belonged. If she belonged, then the questions faded. While this happened, she kept learning. She listened to conversations. She watched rivalries. She mapped the city's social architecture the way she once mapped a household's rules. When she needed to embellish her story, she did it with sensory details, more memories that sounded true because they felt specific. She also had a longer-term calculation. A mistress has an expiration date. Age changes how society judges women. Ida knew that if she wanted permanent security, she needed more than visibility. She needed legal status. She needed a name that could not be dismissed as temporary. So she waited. She positioned herself not merely as pleasure but as partnership. She learned Wood's business habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. She made herself indispensable in ways that were hard to replace. She could not force the next step, but she could make it easier for him to choose it. And that choice, when it came, would transform Ida Mayfield into Ida Wood, moving her from a performance that could be questioned to a role stamped by law. Yet every step forward tightened the trap. The more she gained, the more she had to protect. Because the greater the lie, the greater the fear of someone pulling at the thread. Long before she locked a hotel door, Ida learned this lesson. When you build your life on reinvention, you don't just chase opportunity, you chase control, and control becomes its own kind of addiction. She never forgot that. When Benjamin Wood's wife died, the city expected the usual sequence: mourning, respectability, a careful return to public life. Ida expected something else. She had waited years for a change in her status, and she understood that in her world, status was protection. A mistress could be discarded. A wife had rights. The marriage was quiet, and for some observers it was inconveniently easy. People who had questioned Ida's place now had a document that settled it. She became Mrs. Benjamin Wood, legally attached to a man whose name carried political weight and public visibility. The same society that might have judged her arrangement now greeted her with the familiar hypocrisy of the era. What was improper yesterday became acceptable once the paperwork existed. Ida did not relax. She had climbed into a position that came with hazards. The Wood family did not operate like a gentle household. Their power was connected to politics, and politics in that era was not clean. Benjamin's brother, Fernando, had been mayor and a force in the city's machines. He was famous for manipulating patronage, for using loyalty like a currency, for treating the city as something to be managed rather than served. Those who benefited defended him. Those who suffered called him corrupt, and both sides had reasons. In that environment, Ida learned another lesson: influence attracts enemies. The more visible your life, the more people want a piece of it. Some want invitations, some want favors, some want revenge. The Woods had no shortage of all three. Benjamin's newspaper could praise allies and destroy rivals. Fernando's network could reward friends and punish dissenters. Ida watched how this system worked, and she adjusted her behavior accordingly. She stayed composed in public, careful in private, and attentive to shifts in mood. Yet the greatest threat to her security did not come from politics. It came from Benjamin himself. Benjamin Wood loved gambling. Not casual wagers for amusement, but serious risk that could bend an entire household. Cards, horse races, speculative deals, anything that offered the thrill of uncertainty drew him. For a man who had lived with privilege, risk felt like a game, because he assumed fortune would eventually turn in his favor. Ida did not share that assumption. She had grown up close enough to poverty to respect how quickly a bad streak can become a lifetime. She had watched families collapse from one illness, one firing, one unpaid bill. To her, gambling was not romance. It was a threat. So she did something remarkably modern. She negotiated. Their arrangement was brutally simple. Benjamin could continue his wages without interference. Ida would not lecture him, publicly shame him, or try to change his nature. In exchange, she would receive a defined share of his winnings. His losses, however, were his alone. Ida would not cover them. She would not rescue him with her own funds. If creditors came, they came for him. Benjamin agreed. perhaps believing his wins would outweigh his losses, perhaps grateful for the peace the deal promised, perhaps too confident to see the trap. Ida saw it clearly. She had created a system where upside flowed to her while downside stayed with him, and then she acted on the second half of the strategy. She converted winnings into independence. She did not keep wealth in forms her husband could easily touch. She favored assets held in her own name. She invested, purchased property, and lent money with legal clarity. If Benjamin needed funds, she could provide them on terms. This was not merely greed, it was insurance. Ida understood that affection can fade, reputations can change, and laws can disadvantage women who depend entirely on a man. Her money was a lever and she made sure she held it. Publicly, the couple continued their routines. They appeared at the right places. They were seen in fashionable settings. Ida maintained the image of elegant stability. To strangers, they looked like a successful match, a prominent man and a refined wife. Privately, the balance of power shifted. Benjamin had the title, the newspaper, the connections. Ida had control of the pile of wealth that mattered more than any title when trouble arrived. Trouble did arrive. Benjamin's gambling did not remain harmless. Losses accumulated. Deals went wrong. Debts rose. At times, he was forced to sell pieces of his business to keep it alive. The public did not always see the cracks, but Ida did, and she never forgot what the cracks implied. The life she had built could still fall apart if she let the wrong person hold the keys, so she kept taking her share. She kept separating her assets. She kept building a fortress made of legal ownership and liquid value. In those years, Ida's image hardened. Some people admired her as shrewd. Some gossiped that she controlled her husband. All of them, in their own way, recognized the truth. She was not a decorative spouse. She was a strategist. And strategy required distance. Ida could appear affectionate without becoming vulnerable. She could participate in public life without surrendering control. She could smile in a ballroom while securing the papers that kept her safe. If that sounds calculating, it was, but calculation was her language. She had survived by reading environments, by identifying the rules, and by finding the loopholes. The most revealing aspect of Ida's marriage was not that she tolerated her husband's gambling. It was that she turned it into a steady income stream, then used that income to build a life that could outlast him, because Ida was planning for the day Benjamin could not protect her, could not provide, could not be present, and when that day came, she intended to be ready. In the next layer of her story, we meet the people who lived inside her constructed world, women who carried her chosen name, shared her secrecy, and paid the hidden price of her reinvention. In the Wood household, there was a child. Society saw her, accepted her, and placed her neatly into the story people wanted. The daughter of Benjamin and Ida, a girl born from a long relationship that eventually became a marriage. Her name was Emma, and she moved through rooms and gatherings with the quiet presence of someone taught early not to draw too much attention. But Emma's existence carried an odd tension. She was treated like a daughter, yet her timeline never quite aligned with the public narrative. Investigators, decades later, would discover why Emma was almost certainly not Ida's daughter. She was her sister. That single fact changes the entire shape of the story, because it means Ida did not merely invent herself. She reshaped the identities of the people closest to her. She took a family tie that could reveal her origins and rewrote it into something socially convenient. The simplest explanation is practical. Emma was born in the same year Ellen Walsh left for New York. If Ellen's family was overwhelmed, sending an infant to a newly established older sister might have seemed like relief. But a sister arriving from Massachusetts with an Irish surname would have raised questions in Manhattan's elite circles. A child could be introduced without scrutiny. A sister was harder to explain, so Ida transformed Emma into a daughter. Whether Benjamin would understood the truth remains debated, but the evidence suggests he did. He treated Emma as family, supported the public fiction, and never publicly contradicted Ida's arrangement. He may have believed the lie was harmless. He may have been grateful for the appearance of a conventional household, or he may have simply followed Ida's rules because he recognized her determination. What about Emma herself? That question is darker. If she was Ida's sister, then she grew up inside a manufactured identity. Did she know? When did she know? Was she told the truth in private while forced to maintain the lie in public? Or did she learn only through hints, through overheard conversations, through the slow realization that something about her life didn't match what people said? Emma left almost nothing behind in the way of personal writing. No diary, no public letters, no memoir. We see her through the edges of Ida's life. which means she remains partly invisible. Yet her role was essential. Emma was not a prop for a single moment. She was a supporting structure for decades. And Emma was not alone. Another woman lived with Ida Mary in public descriptions. Mary often appeared as a companion, sometimes as a sister. Mary's position was less suspicious because an unmarried female relative living with a married couple was socially acceptable, especially if the family appeared wealthy. Mary could exist in the household without forcing anyone to ask the wrong questions. Like Emma, she carried the name Ida had chosen. Like Emma, she lived inside Ida's constructed world. Together, the three women formed an unusual unit. Ida was the architect, the planner, the personality at the center. Emma was the daughter, the relationship that made Ida's household look conventional. Mary was the companion, the helper, the person who handled practical contact with the outside world. The arrangement created a kind of closed ecosystem. The women depended on each other, protected each other, and shared the risk of exposure. This is where Ida's story becomes more than ambition. It becomes control. Emma remained close. As Benjamin aged, the household became quieter. The great public displays faded. Ida's social presence diminished. Yet her private financial control increased. She watched her husband's health decline, and she positioned her assets so that when the inevitable happened, she would not be trapped. When Benjamin died, he left behind a public legacy, but not the kind of stability Ida wanted. She had spent years separating her wealth from his risks, and now she had an opportunity to separate her life from the expectations that came with being a prominent widow. Ida arranged a private burial. She refused many guests. People whispered. Some thought it was grief. Others thought it was pride. The more accurate answer may be that Ida was tired of performing. She had performed for decades, and she had reached a point where the performance no longer served her, yet she did not abandon her constructed family. Emma remained with her. Mary remained with her. The three women stayed together as if their identities were braided. If one strand broke, the others might unravel. This is the paradox of Ida's success. She escaped her origins through invention, but the invention created dependence. It required constant maintenance. It required controlling the story, controlling contact, controlling information. And control tends to escalate. The household that once used the city's attention as fuel now began to retreat from attention entirely. Ida sold major assets, shifted investments, and began moving through hotels instead of maintaining a large home. Hotels offered convenience, anonymity, and a buffer between her and anyone who might ask questions. A hotel staff could be managed with cash and clear boundaries. Neighbors could not watch the windows. Then, in 1907, the outside world delivered the final trigger. Financial panic. Banks faltered. Depositors lined up to pull out savings. Trust cracked. For most people, panic was fear. For Ida, panic was confirmation. She had seen systems fail before. She believed institutions were fragile and that relying on them was surrender. So she did what her entire life had trained her to do. She seized control. She withdrew sums in forms she could physically possess. She preferred cash and negotiable instruments that did not require a bank's survival. She took the wealth she had built and carried it toward the one place she could enforce absolute rules, a closed door. And Emma and Mary went with her. In the next part, we follow them into that decision, into the hotel, into the suite, and into the strange, quiet rhythm of a life lived as if the outside world were the enemy. By 1907, Ida had already proven she could survive scandal, rumor, and the shifting tides of New York's elite. What she had never faced, at least not directly, was the kind of collective terror that spreads when money systems wobble. The panic of 1907 hit the country like a fever. Banks faced runs. Trust vanished overnight. People who believed their savings were safe discovered that safe was an agreement, not a guarantee. Ida watched it unfold and felt something colder than fear, recognition. She had lived long enough to see fortunes evaporate. She had watched men gamble away stability, watched businesses collapse, watched institutions fail people who had trusted them. Her entire financial philosophy had become a single sentence: if you can't hold it, you don't own it. So she acted with speed and conviction. She went to her banks and withdrew immense sums, not a cautious portion, but the whole pile she could access. She insisted on forms that did not depend on a bank's continuing health: large bills, negotiable bonds, items that could be transferred without asking anyone's permission. She converted abstract wealth into physical control. Then she made a decision that confused anyone who believed wealth naturally leads to comfort. She chose a hotel, not a mansion. A hotel offered anonymity. A hotel offered a professional staff who could be managed with cash. A hotel also offered something else: the ability to close a door without neighbors noticing. Ida took adjoining rooms, paid in advance, and set rules that sounded simple but would become absolute. No maid service, no unnecessary entry, deliver food to the door, leave newspapers outside, collect rent in cash without questions. Emma and Mary came with her. Whether they understood the full purpose of the move is unclear, but they followed. In the beginning, the arrangement may have felt temporary, a cautious pause until the panic settled. But as weeks became months, the temporary hardened into permanence. The door closed, and it stayed closed at first. The staff likely interpreted the situation as eccentricity. New York had wealthy eccentrics in every decade, people who disliked noise, disliked company, disliked being seen. As long as bills were paid, hotels tolerated strange boundaries. A long-term resident with strict rules was preferable to a short-term guest who caused trouble years past. The building changed around them. Employees rotated. Managers came and went. The women remained unseen. Rent continued to arrive on time. Food orders continued to appear at the door. The routine became so normal that curiosity faded. Inside the rooms, the world became smaller and denser. Newspapers arrived daily, and instead of being discarded, they were stacked. Boxes accumulated. Packages were wrapped and stored. String, paper, and remnants of deliveries gathered. What began as clutter turned into a landscape. Dust settled. Odors deepened. The room became a physical record of time, written in paper. Why keep the newspapers? One possibility is simple practicality. Newspapers were her window to the outside. Ida had used papers for decades to study society. Now she used them to watch a world she refused to join. Wars began and ended. Presidents rose and fell. The city changed with automobiles and skyscrapers. Ida watched it all through ink. To her, paper felt safer than people. Within their closed routine, roles emerged. Ida remained the center, the authority. Mary handled practical interaction with the outside world. She was the one who opened the door a crack, passed cash to the desk, and received deliveries. Emma assisted, organizing, mending, existing as quiet support. In a sealed environment, small tasks become identity. The women ate simply. Their orders did not evolve with trends. They did not entertain. They did not travel. Their social world shrank to 2 rooms and each other. The longer they remained inside, the harder leaving became. Leaving would mean facing changed streets, changed technology, changed expectations. It would mean inviting questions. It would mean risking exposure. And exposure mattered, because Ida's identity was still a performance. Even if she had legally become Ida Wood, her origins remained hidden. The longer she stayed out of view, the safer her constructed story became. Absence protects lies. Presence invites scrutiny. Time, however, is not impressed by strategy. Ma weakened first, whether it was illness, depression, malnutrition, or simply the wear of confinement. Her health declined until the closed world could no longer pretend it was sustainable. Doctors were called. For the first time in decades, outsiders entered the rooms. They saw conditions that shocked them, crowded, stale, filled with paper and neglect. Emma was taken to a hospital and did not return. Records described her in the role Ida had assigned, a daughter. The fiction survived her. Ida and Mary remained. The rooms felt emptier, but the rules stayed the same. They continued stacking papers. They continued guarding the hidden wealth. They continued refusing entry. Age pressed in, and still Ida resisted change. By the early 1930s. Ida was extremely old, and Mary was aging too. Their bodies were failing inside a space that was never meant for permanent living, yet neither seemed willing to surrender control. Perhaps they believed surrender would invite theft. Perhaps they believed surrender would invite humiliation. Perhaps they believed surrender would invite the truth. Then Mary began to die, and death has a way of forcing doors open when Mary's condition became impossible to ignore. Ida did what she had avoided for 24 years. She called for help. The crack in the system appeared. A maid heard. A manager arrived. A doctor entered. The closed world was breached. From that breach came the body, the stench, the piles of papers and the fortune hidden in places only Ida had known. What seemed like eccentric isolation became a national mystery overnight. In the next part, we move from the sealed rooms to the loud, hungry world outside, the headlines, the crowds, the claimants, and the investigation that began to pull Ida's life apart. Once the sealed rooms were opened, the story no longer belonged to Ida. It belonged to everyone with an appetite for outrage, wonder, or hope. In 1931, America was desperate. Jobs had vanished. Savings had evaporated. Families stood in lines for bread. In that atmosphere, a tale of a hidden fortune was not just entertainment, it was emotional gasoline. Newspapers rushed to frame the story in the most gripping way possible. Some leaned into horror, the filthy rooms, the dead sister, the strange meals eaten in isolation. Others leaned into fantasy, a lost society, beauty, a woman who had once glittered in public now living like a ghost. And many leaned into moral shock. While the city suffered, a woman had guarded wealth she refused to spend. Reporters flooded the hotel. They pressured staff for details, leaned on managers, and tried to secure photographs. The lobby became a stage. Curious citizens arrived just to stand near the building and point at the windows. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the mystery, but Ida offered none. She was moved to a private facility for care, and she refused most questions. When she did speak, she repeated her familiar story. She was Ida Wood, widow of a prominent man, and she had no interest in explaining her life to strangers. The legal system, however, demanded answers. With Mary dead and Ida clearly unable to manage the estate alone, a court appointed administrators to inventory the assets and secure them. That process revealed even more than the hotel search had suggested. Beyond cash sewn into clothing and valuables hidden in boxes, there were accounts, deeds, and papers that indicated Ida's wealth was scattered across forms she had either forgotten or purposely concealed. The total value became a moving target as new items were uncovered. The announcement of that total triggered the next wave claimants. People began to appear with stories. Some arrived with sincere belief that they were related to Benjamin Wood. Others claimed connection to the glamorous Southern family Ida had described for decades. Some produced genealogies that looked impressive on paper and collapsed under scrutiny. A few brought forged documents and practiced confidence, gambling that the confusion surrounding Ida's identity would make fraud easier. A cottage industry formed overnight, selling hope, paperwork, and promises to anyone willing to believe a stranger's family story. Soon, the number of claims swelled into chaos. Courts faced stacks of paperwork. Lawyers faced endless interviews. Newspapers published lists of supposed relatives. Strangers suddenly introduced themselves as cousins. Some people reinvented their own pasts to fit the fortune, mirroring Ida's talent for narrative. The administrator's problem was simple to define and hard to solve. Who, exactly, was Ida Wood? If she was truly who she said, then the heirs might be found through the Wood family line or through the Mayfield family she claimed. But if her identity was uncertain, then the entire map changed. And the more the administrators examined her papers, the more they saw irreclarismo, inconsistencies that suggested the story might be constructed. This is where the case shifted from sensational to methodical. A fortune can be divided only when the law can name the rightful recipients. Naming recipients requires naming the deceased, and in Ida's case, the name itself was the question. Investigators began with the facts that were easiest to verify: marriage records, business documents, property deeds. Ida was indeed legally married to Benjamin Wood. She did appear in society pages in earlier decades. She did have assets registered under her name, so the public identity was not entirely fiction. But the deeper identity, the origin story, was harder to pin down. Then a detail surfaced that acted like a crack in glass. It involved Emma. If Emma was Ida's daughter, then there should be a clear record of her birth, her parentage, and her early life. Yet early documents were scarce, and later documents seemed oddly consistent in a way that sometimes suggests paperwork was shaped to match a preferred narrative. The investigators realized that if they could untangle Emma's origin, they might find a thread leading to Ida's true past. So they traced Emma backwards through whatever records existed. Census entries, hospital records, certificates, anything that anchored her. And in doing so, they found evidence pointing away from the Wood story and toward another surname entirely. That surname opened a new door. Not in a hotel, but in history. It suggested that Ida's glamorous Southern father might never have existed. It suggested that the Mayfield name might have been chosen rather than inherited. It suggested that the fortune at the center of this scandal belonged not to a society built by birth, but to a woman who had invented her position through sheer force of will for the claimants. This possibility was terrifying. Hundreds had built their hopes on the Mayfield legend. Others had built their claims on the Wood line. If Ida was neither Mayfield nor an heir-producing Wood, then most of them would receive nothing. $1 million dream would evaporate. For the investigators, the possibility was irresistible. It meant the mystery was not merely a story about hiding money. It was a story about hiding identity. And so the hunt moved beyond Manhattan. It moved into archives, parish books, local registries, and distant family histories. The estate administrators needed a person who could chase threads with patience and skepticism. Someone who would treat every claim as suspect and every document as a clue. As the public shouted and the claimants multiplied, the real work began in silence. It would take time. It would take travel. It would take a willingness to follow a name across oceans, and when it was done, the conclusion would be stranger than the hoarded fortune itself, because it would reveal that the most valuable thing Ida had hidden was not money, that it was her beginning. A fortune invites noise, but a courtroom demands clarity. Once administrators secured Ida's assets, the case became less about the spectacle of hoarding and more about a technical problem. An estate cannot be distributed until the law knows who the deceased really was. In most cases, that question is simple. Birth records, marriage records, family testimony. In Ida's case, every category was slippery. The investigators began with what looked solid. Ida had a legal marriage to Benjamin Wood. Property deeds existed under her married name. Earlier society notices placed her in New York's public life, so the Ida Wood identity was real in a practical sense. The question was what came before it, and whether the before mattered for inheritance. Inheritance depends on blood, not on performance. If Ida had no children, then the court had to determine whether the estate flowed through her husband's line, her own family line, or both, depending on what assets belonged to whom. Hundreds of claimants insisted they could answer that. Their answers contradicted each other. Emma's identity offered the first promising layer. If Emma was Ida's daughter, she would anchor Ida's family history. If she was not Ida's daughter, then she would expose a lie large enough to suggest others. Investigators searched for Emma's earliest records. Later documents presented her consistently as Emma Wood, daughter of Benjamin and Ida, but later documents can be shaped. The earlier the record, the harder it is to forge. The investigators kept pushing backward until they found an original birth record in Massachusetts. That record did not call her Emma Wood. It called her Emma Walsh, child of Thomas and Anne Walsh. That single discovery did two things at once. It destroyed the clean public narrative of Ida's household, and it offered a new path, the Walsh path. If Emma was a Walsh, then Ida might be one to. The investigators searched for Ida in early American records under the Walsh name, census entries, employment references, any trace. They found scattered clues suggesting a family that moved and dispersed. Then they broadened the search to immigration and, ultimately, to British records. Eventually, a record appeared that fit too well to ignore, a baptismal entry for an Ellen Walsh, born in the late 1830s in an English mill town. Two Irish parents whose names matched the ones on Emma's American birth record. The dates aligned, the parental names aligned, the pattern aligned. The probability of coincidence shrank to near zero. Ida Wood, the elegant widow, was Ellen Walsh. This conclusion did not rest on one document. It rested on a chain, Emma's birth record tying her to Walsh parents, immigration patterns consistent with that family, and British parish records anchoring Ellen's origin. The investigator assembled this chain carefully because courts do not accept dramatic assertions. They accept evidence. Once the Walsh identity emerged, the Mayfield story collapsed. The southern plantation Father Ida described for decades was not found. The aristocratic lineage was not traced. The Mayfield name looked like what it likely was, a chosen name designed to sound like privilege. For the claimants who had built their hopes on Mayfield ancestry, this was devastating. Their genealogies became worthless overnight. For the claimants tied to Benjamin Wood, it complicated matters, because the estate's division depended on which assets were truly Ida's and which were tied to Benjamin's line. And for the Walsh descendants' ordinary families scattered across New England, it was astonishing. Many of them had no idea their relative had become wealthy. Some likely had never heard her new name. In court, the process unfolded slowly. Evidence was presented piece by piece. The judge listened to testimony, reviewed documents, and weighed the credibility of each claim. While newspapers wanted a single dramatic moment, the legal system delivered a steady dismantling. In hearings, lawyers argued over dates and signatures, while reporters waited outside for drama. Inside, the only drama was the slow tightening of proof, relentless. That silence is part of her story. Ida had lived by controlling narrative. In a courtroom, she could no longer control it. The papers spoke louder than she could. As the investigation progressed, administrators also found assets IDA seemed to have forgotten. Dormant accounts, untouched boxes, deeds in surprising places. This suggested a mind that had once been razor-sharp had narrowed to a single obsession: guard what you can touch, and ignore what you cannot see. The hotel hoard had become the center of her reality, even though her wealth existed beyond it. Eventually, the court identified a small set of legitimate heirs through the Walsh line. The thousands of hopeful claimants melted away. Most received nothing. A few were exposed as frauds. The fortune, which had seemed like a prize waiting for anyone clever enough to claim it, returned to a mundane legal truth. Inheritance follows documentation. The irony was sharp. Ellen Walsh had spent her life escaping the stigma of her family name, and in the end, her wealth returned to that family name anyway. The money circled back to the origin she had tried to erase. Yet the investigators' revelation did not reduce Ida to a simple villain. It revealed a woman who had understood the cruelty of her era and responded with invention. She lied, yes, but she also built. She exploited a society that rewarded appearances. She used intelligence where others used inheritance. She treated identity as something that could be designed, then defended. The question that remained was not whether she was Ellen Walsh. The question was what that meant. Was her story a warning about deception, a parable about ambition, a tragedy about fear, or a demonstration of how fragile social categories really are? In the final parts, we move beyond the legal conclusion and into the human aftermath. What happened to the fortune? What happened to the myth? And what we are left with when a person's chosen name becomes the only name the world remembers. When the court finally accepted that Ida Wood had been born Ellen Walsh, the story shifted one last time. For months, the public had treated the case like a lottery with 1,000 tickets. People believed cleverness or persistence might win. But inheritance is not entertainment. It is paperwork. Once the documents spoke clearly, most of the noise collapsed. The court's decision narrowed the field to a small set of legitimate heirs connected through the Walsh family line. They were not society figures. They were not political dynasties. They were ordinary people, clerks, laborers, teachers, some of them living modestly, some of them barely holding on during the Depression. Many had never met Ida. Some may not have known she existed. Yet they were the ones the law recognized. For those heirs, the money was transformative. Debts could be paid, homes could be secured, businesses could be started, children could attend school instead of working early. The fortune that had sat idle in a hotel suite began to circulate back into the world, not through glamorous parties but through practical relief. For the rejected claimants, the outcome was bitter. Some had spent money pursuing their claims. Some had built their hopes around a story that turned out to be fiction. A few had committed fraud and faced exposure. It became a hard lesson. Desperation turns rumor into religion fast. Ida herself, at the center of this storm, remained strangely distant. By the time the legal process matured, she was extremely old and living under care. She did not mount a dramatic defense of her identity. She did not confess. She did not write a final statement explaining why she had disappeared. She offered fragments, and then she receded behind silence. That silence frustrates anyone who wants a neat moral conclusion. We want the liar to admit she lied. We want the mystery to end with an explanation that feels proportional to the mystery. But Ida's life was not built to satisfy spectators. It was built to serve her. She died in 1932. Her death did not arrive with theatrical irony. It arrived the way most deaths do, quietly, in a controlled environment, attended by people who knew her as a difficult patient with a complicated estate. The woman who once moved through New York's elite circles, who once insisted she had danced with royalty, ended her life far from that stage. She was buried under the name she chose. Not Ellen Walsh, not Ida Mayfield. Ida Wood. That detail matters. Names are usually inherited. Ida treated names as tools. She selected a name, lived inside it for decades, and carried it into the ground. Even after the courts revealed her birth identity, the chosen identity remained her public marker. The world tends to remember what it can pronounce easily, and it can pronounce Ida Wood. So what remains? One interpretation is condemnation. She lied, manipulated relationships, and created a prison of secrecy. She took money out of circulation and guarded it while others suffered. She rewrote her sister's identity. She built an elaborate fiction and demanded that people around her live within it. The hotel seclusion is the hardest piece to interpret. Was it mental illness? There is evidence of obsession, hoarding, and paranoia. Was it trauma? Years of performing a fragile identity could create constant fear. Was it strategy? Withdrawal from banks before a crash suggests foresight. Withdrawal from society suggests a desire to avoid scrutiny as age made her story harder to maintain. Perhaps it was all of these. Human behavior rarely fits a single label. Consider what Ida chose to protect. If the only goal had been comfort, She could have lived quietly in a clean apartment and paid trusted staff. If the only goal had been safety, she could have used secure vaults. Instead, she created a sealed environment where money was always within reach. That suggests the money was not merely wealth. It was reassurance. It was proof she had escaped. It was the tangible substitute for the legitimacy she never fully believed she had. And consider the cost. Emma died under a borrowed identity. Mary died in a cramped suite that smelled of decay. Ida died with her secrets exposed anyway. The fortress did not ultimately preserve the narrative. It only delayed the reckoning. Yet delay was part of Ida's skill. She had delayed poverty. She had delayed exposure. She had delayed the ordinary limits placed on women like her. For decades, she succeeded. What does that say about society? It says that the doors we assume are locked are sometimes guarded only by assumptions. It says that confidence can override investigation. It says that people often accept a story if the storyteller looks like the kind of person who should have it. It also says something about fear. Fear can become a builder. It can build contracts, savings, routines, fortresses, and silence. Ida's fear built her fortune and then built the prison where she guarded it. In the end, the fortune returned to the family she erased. The name she invented remained on her grave. The public fascination moved on to other scandals. And a century later, we are left with a question that feels uncomfortably modern. How much of identity is truth, and how much is performance? Ida answered that question with her life. She proved that a person can manufacture a new self and live inside it for decades. She also proved that paper trails outlast performances. If you want a moral, it might be this: reinvention can change your future, but it cannot delete your past. You can run from the story you were born into. You can even outrun it for a lifetime. But eventually, someone will open a door, turn on the light, and start reading the documents you never expected them to find. And when they do, the world will decide who you were, whether you agree or not. There is a reason Ida Wood's story keeps resurfacing. It has the elements: people crave money, secrecy, glamour, decay, but it also has something quieter, a psychological mirror. Almost everyone understands the urge to be seen differently. Ida simply pursued that urge with an intensity most people would never dare. And then she paid a price most people would never accept. Start with the beginning and the end, side by side. A girl from an immigrant family learns the rules of status by cleaning the homes of people who have it. An old woman clings to a fortune by sewing it into her clothing and refusing to let anyone into her room. On paper, those images look unrelated. In human terms, they are the same emotion stretched across time. Fear of falling back into powerlessness. That fear can be productive. It can push a person to study, to plan, to negotiate, to save. It can also become corrosive. It can shrink a life until the only thing that feels safe is control. And the only control that feels real is the kind you can touch. Ida touched everything she trusted. She touched cash. She touched bonds. She touched jewelry. She touched stacks of newspapers. She touched the door. She trusted those objects because they did not argue with her, judge her, or ask questions about where she came from. People did. The most unsettling part of her story is how well the invention worked. For decades, Ida Mayfield and then Ida Wood moved through powerful circles. She was photographed, discussed, praised, and envied. If her origins had been common knowledge, much of that access might have been denied. Instead, society accepted the persona because it wanted to. It wanted the pleasure of believing it could spot elegance at a glance. It wanted the story of the Southern Belle. It wanted the performance, so the performance became real enough to shape lives. Emma lived as a daughter because that role protected the larger narrative. Mary lived as a companion inside the same enclosure. Benjamin lived with a wife who treated money like a contract. Everyone around Ida adjusted to the world she insisted on. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it suggests that identity is not only a private truth, it is also a social agreement. If enough people agree, the agreement can carry more weight than documents until someone decides to check. The legal investigator in Ida's case did what society rarely does. He checked. He treated every confident claim as something that needed proof. He looked for earliest records. He followed names across decades. He trusted ink more than reputation, and by doing that, he demonstrated a harsh rule: you can build a life on performance, but you cannot stop the past from existing in storage. Her motives likely blended calculation with genuine fear. So what was the hotel suite, really? You can interpret it as a bunker, built against the failures of banks and men. You can interpret it as a hiding place, built against the risk of someone tracing her past. You can interpret it as a shrine built to the one thing she trusted, possession, or you can interpret it as punishment, self-inflicted, for a life that required constant deception. Whatever the correct answer, the suite functioned as a time capsule. When it opened, the modern world collided with a past that had been deliberately frozen. That collision created the sensation people remember: a fortune in filthy boxes, bills sewn into clothing, an old woman with strangely preserved skin, a dead companion on a couch. It felt like fiction because it was too symbolic to be ordinary, but it was ordinary in one important sense. It was human. Humans hoard what they fear losing. Humans hide what they fear being judged for. Humans build stories about themselves, and then defend those stories when threatened. Ida's story is simply a concentrated version of those impulses. The tragedy is that her defenses were never permanent. Emma died, Mary died, the door opened, the papers were read, the fortune was counted, the heirs were found. The narrative she controlled for decades became evidence in a court file, yet even after that she kept one piece of control. She kept the public name. She died as Ida Wood, and that is the name most people remember. Ellen Walsh survives in archives. Ida Wood survives in headlines. The invented self outlived the original in popular memory. Maybe that is what she wanted all along. Not a perfect lie, but a lasting one. If you're watching this and thinking, how could anyone choose to live like that? Then ask a sharper question. What would you do to guarantee you never have to beg again? What would you trade for certainty, comfort, freedom, connection, truth? Ida traded almost all of it, and if you're thinking, she got away with it, remember the hotel room. Remember the dust. Remember the silence. Getting away can look like winning from the outside while feeling like imprisonment from the inside. So when you hear about someone reinventing themselves, changing names, changing backgrounds, changing stories, don't assume it's harmless. Reinvention can be a ladder, but it can also become a cage. The same skills that help you climb can also keep you trapped, because the higher you climb on an invented story, the more terrified you become of falling. That is the final echo of Ida Wood. The fear that success built on performance can vanish if anyone sees too closely. If this story made you think, please like the video, and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more deep dives into human mysteries, forgotten lives, and the hidden logic behind impossible stories. And in the comments, tell me this: was Ida's 24 years behind a closed door a breakdown, a strategy, or both? Because sometimes the strangest mystery isn't where the money came from, that's what it costs to keep it.